Welcome to another session of Officiating Wrestling by the Book. This module focuses on a quick history lesson on the NFHS interpretation of supporting points. As a precursor to this module, you'll want to have watched the following two modules. First, the one on supporting points, and second, the one on inbounds and out-of-bounds rules. So what's the controversy here? Well, we have too many officials that have not been trained on the definition of supporting points that comes out of the NFHS rules book, and that results in the following problems. First, we have inconsistent application of that definition. Second, we've got officials that are mistaking incidental body parts that might be touching the mat for supporting points. Thirdly, many officials are just unaware of the decades-long interpretation the NFHS has had regarding supporting points. And fourth, there's inconsistent application of the inbounds and out-of-bounds rules going on. So, in order to get a good understanding, let's go back in time to the 1989-90s rule book. And Rule 5-2-1 was where the definition of supporting points resided at that time. And there were pictures with captions that were very instructive for officials in order to understand the NFHS's interpretation of supporting points. So we'll go back to those pictures right now. Here's the first one. As you can see, we've got the defending wrestler on his rear end beyond the boundary line with his feet touching the mat inside the boundary, and the attacking wrestler with his up on his toes inside the boundary line, his knees inside the boundary line, even though they're off the mat, and his elbows and his forehead posted to the mat beyond the boundary line. And what does the caption tell us? Well, it says, this is a takedown since the knees, while above the mat, are inside the boundary line. If the knees are outside the boundary line, it would not be a takedown. Keep in mind, back in 1989, they had not yet implemented the edge of mat takedown or reversal rule, which allowed for wrestlers to score even though the situation was out of bounds, as long as the feet finished in bounds. So the second picture that went along with this, here we've got the defending wrestler a little bit further out of bounds now, right? No part of his body's even inside the boundary line anymore. And this time the attacking wrestler is in the same position, except that now his knees are beyond the boundary line, but his toes are still inside the boundary line. And what does the caption tell us? Well, it says, this is not a takedown since the supporting points are outside the boundary line with the knees on or off the mat. And that's critical right there. Whether the knees were on or off the mat, they considered the supporting points to be the knees, and they are beyond the boundary line, therefore they were out of bounds. So what the NFHS was telling us and was instructing officials is that the knees are the supporting points in this body position, whether they're touching the mat or not. And that's a subtlety that not many people remember, which is that your supporting points, your key supporting points, could be body parts that aren't even touching the mat. So let's take a little walk through history here, the timeline. So back in 1989, just like I illustrated, Rule 5-2-1, the official NFHS interpretation was that supporting points did not always have to be touching the mat. In 1991, that's when the takedown rule and the reversal rule got modified to allow scoring even though the wrestlers landed out of bounds. Thus, the takedown could be scored if all the supporting points remain in bounds for one of the wrestlers, or if at least the feet finish in bounds, even though the supporting points are out of bounds. And that's a key distinction here, because what the rules book in 1991 put in the points of emphasis was there has been no change in the out of bounds rule or when out of bounds should be called. Also, the supporting points definition never changed. Therefore, the inbounds and out of bounds rule, which never changed, was not affected either. So, supporting points were not changed. All they were doing when they changed this rule was saying, yes, you can land out of bounds and we can award a takedown as long as the moment you land out of bounds, you have control and your feet finish in bounds. Your feet are not the supporting points. They just are a objective marker we can look at to see if they are still touching the mat in bounds as you complete the maneuver, then you can score the points. However, what happened was a lot of officials now started incorrectly considering the toes as supporting points in these edge of mat takedown situations. And the NFHS did not address the issue. So we had officials that thought as long as a wrestler stays up on his toes and never has his knees touch the mat beyond the boundary line, that he could keep wrestling and that his toes could be considered supporting points. And that ran completely counter to the NFHS's understanding and interpretation around supporting points. And then an odd thing happened in the year 2013, almost 24 years later. The NFHS made an edit to Rule 5-15-2, which is where the inbounds rule, which is where the definition of supporting points now resides. And that rule got edited, and the phrase "or within" was removed from the definition of supporting points. So the definition always said supporting points are parts of the body touching, or within the wrestling area. And that's why the NFHS did not require supporting points to be in contact with the mat with the use of that phrase, touching, or within the wrestling area. And so this edit got made, and then the NFHS didn't even say anything about that change to the text of the rule. So we're not clear as to what they were thinking when they removed that phrase, but it has unintended consequences now because it sort of undermines a little bit decades of interpretation around supporting points and the fact that they didn't have to be touching the mat. That's not, the NFHS never considered that they had to necessarily be touching the mat to be the supporting points. So let's look at those edge of mat situations again. Go back to those same pictures, and if you want, you can put together a little table here, and you can pause the video and sort of stare at these and look at how I deconstruct based on the pictures and based on what the NFHS was telling us with their interpretation. But in this situation here, again, with the wrestler on his toes, with his knees off the mat, but his knees above the mat, that was considered inbounds. Now you see in this little table, and you're going to see multiple versions of this little table just to sort of illustrate whether the knees are touching the mat or not touching the mat. What the ruling was from the NFHS. So if we take the body parts that are potentially contacting the mat in this situation for the attacking wrestler, his forehead, his elbows, his knees, and his toes, and then we ask the question, is that body part in contact with the mat? Yes or no? And is that body part inside the boundary line? Yes or no? Then you can see that in this particular picture, he is considered inbounds whether or not his knees are touching the mat or not. Now, if we look at the other picture, and again, the same table, here the interpretation was this wrestler that's attacking, he is out of bounds on this takedown attempt, whether his knees are touching the mat or not. And so again, we're looking at the same four body parts, and they're sort of, three of them are in the exact same positions. The forehead, the elbows are in contact with mat beyond the boundary line in both cases, and then the toes are inside the boundary line in both pictures. What differs is where the knees are located relative to the boundary line. But again, the NFHS was emphasizing to us, it doesn't matter whether the knees are touching the mat or not. They are considering those knees the supporting points, even when they're not touching the mat. And what they're looking for is where those knees are relative to the boundary line in order to make a proper assessment of whether or not a wrestler was in bounds. So what you see here then through these pictures and the captions and the interpretation was that the NFHS did not intend for us to ever consider that this attacking wrestler could have his toes be his supporting parts when he's in this position where he's stretched out that way. And here we are in year 2017, and in the rules clinics for this year, we can see, again, a re-emphasis of this age-old principle that what the caption is saying in this video is that wrestlers are out of bounds because toes are not supporting points down on the mat. Okay, and again, this has been around for decades, this interpretation, because the NFHS has never ever considered the toes as supporting points when they are down on the mat in this position. And again, if you go look at the module on supporting points and the concept and principle around where's the weight distribution, you cannot have a majority of your weight on your toes when you're parallel to the mat this way. So let's look at one last thing, an extreme example. And if we look here and see that the wrestler on top in the white singlet and the wrestler on the bottom in the blue singlet, well, the wrestler on top, his supporting points are his knees, and they are inside the boundary line, right? And the wrestler on the bottom, his supporting points are his knees, and they are in, or perhaps it's hard to see, but maybe you might consider that he's on the side of his hip over there, but that's inside the boundary line as well. So, you would never declare this situation out of bounds just due to the fact that a couple of body parts with incidental contact on the mat are beyond the boundary line. So that top wrestler's left hand and that bottom wrestler's right hand are both touching the mat beyond the boundary line. But we would never, ever say that this situation is out of bounds. That would be not only wrong, it would be outrageously wrong. So remember that the NFHS has a long-standing interpretation about supporting points, and we need to be grounded in the definition. Unfortunately, now we do have a bit of a controversy because they changed the definition and removed that phrase "or within." So body parts touching or within the wrestling area. So that leaves us with a little bit of a conundrum. But anyway, that's a brief history of the NFHS's official interpretation on supporting points.